My name is Sharon Hughes and I'm the Global Technical Marketing Manager for rodenticides with BASF. Today I'd like to do a small presentation on pulse baiting with Storm and Storm Ultra rodenticide baits. So the content that I would like to cover is just a very brief introduction and then a few slides on surplus baiting technique and pulse baiting technique. And then relating to the toxicity of the rodenticide and the baiting technique that should be used. And that's toxicity to the target species, the rats and the mice. And then on a practical level, how to actually pulse bait. And an example of a pulse baiting field trial. And then ending with the advantages of using pulse baiting. Anticoagulant baits, there are two types of practical baiting technique. One is called surplus baiting, or sometimes referred to as saturation baiting, and the other is pulse baiting, and it's the pulse baiting that is for the Storm and the Storm Ultra products. And also pulse baiting is for trained professionals only in Europe. In all areas of treatment though, both techniques utilise the code of practice for that country. So for the UK, it's the CREW code of practice. Starting with the surplus baiting technique, we can now look at what that actually means and how to use it. Surplus baiting is used for all multi-feed anticoagulant baits. So what does that mean? It means that a rat or a mouse has to eat many times, multiple times, in order to actually eat a lethal amount of bait. So you can see it's related to the toxicity of that bait. And so that each rodent in the infestation can actually feed multiple times, then there has to be then a surplus amount of bait available for the infestation. So bait must always be available at each and every bait point for surplus baiting to be successful. And what this means is that bait point sizes for surplus bait needs to be larger. And a typical example that they're normally around 200 grams. And then also, again, to make sure that there is always this surplus at each bait point, so surplus as in more than the rodent needs, the bait replenishment must be more frequent. Again, the larger bait point sizes and more frequent replenishment always ensure that there is a surplus amount of bait available at each bait point. So what do we mean by pulse baiting? Which ones are pulse baited? So pulse baiting can only be used if the rodenticide bait is potent enough in the rats and mice that a lethal dose can be ingested in just a single feed. And there we have the definition of a single feed that with rodenticide that could be used for pulse baiting. So a single feed is defined as it's one that is so potent a lethal dose can be delivered when an animal consumes on a single occasion only a fraction of its daily food requirement. And we'll come back, so there is no actual definition of what this fraction is, but I'll come to a slide in a few moments about how here at BASF we interpret this and calculate this. Which rodenticide baits fall into the category of those that are potent enough in the rats and mice that a single feed can be it's sufficient for a lethal dose? Well, it's those that contain the second generation anticoagulants, brodifacoum or flocoumafen. And it's flocoumafen that's in the BASF Storm and Storm Ultra baits. As a result of the potency of these two active ingredients, we have the benefit as well that there is actually no practical resistance in the rats and mice to these two actives, nor is there any resistance to diphenthylone from the previous slide. What are the practicalities behind the pulse baiting technique? Well, there are several factors that are employed that are unique to pulse baiting. One of the first ones that I want to mention is the fact that there may be times when there is actually no bait down at the infestation. And this is fine because the potency of the rodenticide and the baiting technique, they allow for this factor. So I mean by that, maybe the bait's placed on day 1, it's eaten by day 2 or 3, and then the next pulse, the next replenishment, that might not be till day 4 or day 7, and then again on day 14, and between day 7 and 14 it could be that the bait has been eaten within 1 or 2 days, but that's okay, and that's factored into this technique. The other thing to consider is that there's actually less bait placed per bait point, and again this is related to the toxicity of the bait in the target species. And because we're doing it in this pulse way, there are actually less visits to replenish, because there is no worry that the operator has to go back to ensure that there is surplus amount of bait there. As we've mentioned, if there's no bait, then that's okay. You still don't have to visit until the next pulse as per the label. And then also, pulse baiting is not related to the physical form of the bait. So for example, a storm block or pasta or pellet, they would all still be pulse baited because it's related to the active ingredient, and that's the flocoumafen. Another thing to raise is the fact that it's not related to palatability. If we have a bait that's pulse baited, so it's potent in a single feed and it's highly palatable, well that's important as well, because obviously we don't just want a powerful active, a potent active, we want the rats and the mice to actually want to eat the bait as well. But if, for example, a bait that contains one of the multi-feed actives, such as a bait that contains bromadiolone or diphenocum, if they were then formulated to make a super palatable bait, then it would still be a multi-feed bait. So it can't be factored in that if you have a super palatable multi-feed, it can then be bumped up to a single feed. That's not the case. It's all related to the active ingredient. I've briefly touched on this in the past few slides, but now I want to talk about the toxicity and how that relates to the baiting technique. So how do we measure, how do we determine what amount of food is actually a single feed? If we look at the graph on the left-hand side, then this measures rat activity from dawn till dusk, when they are at the most active, rats being nocturnal creatures. And we can see that when they arise at, say, 6 p.m. at dusk, then there is a flurry of activity, leading to a peak of activity on what I've labelled 1. And what I've labelled 4, is that a separate flurry of activity, or is that leading up to the first peak? And then we have definitely 2 other peaks labelled 2 and 3. And these peaks of activity are directly related to the activity involved in foraging, in finding feed. So we can see that there are 3 and maybe 4 definitely foraging activities where the rodent is looking for food and looking to feed. So if we now look at the chart on the right hand side, here we've taken as a typical example a 250 gram brown rat. We know that they eat approximately 10% of their body weight in food a day. So that's approximately 25 grams of food a day for our brown rat. And if this amount of food, this 25 grams, is going to be ingested in this 3 to 4 feeding periods, then that means that each one is 6 to 8 grams. So we have either 3 feeds at 8 grams or 4 feeds at 6 grams. So an average of 6 to 8 grams. And this isn't an exact science in the fact that obviously there is a lot of variation within how much rodents feed, and that's dependent on the availability of food and the competition within the infestation. But this is a typical value. Obviously rodents could decide that they need to eat all of their food or half their food intake in a single feed. Others may just take a small proportion of their daily food in their single feed, depending on, like I said, the factors that come into play. This table demonstrates how we can relate the potency of the anticoagulant bait to whether it's a surplus or pulse baited, so whether it's to a multi-feed or a single feed. And if we look at the second column, that names each of the active ingredients that we've mentioned before. We can see coumatetraol, bromadiolone, etc. And then in brackets, it's the percentage in that bait of the active ingredient. So we start with the first generations and then the second generations, and then moving down to brodifacoum, flocoumafen. In the third column, the figures in black represent the LD50 for our 250 gram brown rat. And what the LD50 means, it's the amount of bait that our 250 gram brown rat would have to eat to stand a 50-50 chance of dying. And we can see that these figures vary from 11 with a coumatetraol with the first generation. We have 9 with difenicum, 5.7 with diphenhydramine, and then brodifacoum 2.1. So we've changed, we've come down half, really, more than half, a fifth for some of them. And then flocoumafen 1.9. And flocoumafen is the active in Storm at 0.005% and in Storm Ultra at 0.025%. And we can see these LD50 values, but that's only for a 50-50 chance of dying. Obviously we want to make certain that our rat is going to die. So to be certain, we have like a belt and braces figure, and that's twice the LD50. And they're the values in orange. So this is now the lethal dose. And if we look at the lethal dose, we can see for coumatetraol, a bait containing coumatetraol, it's 22 grams. So we can see that there's no way that that could be eaten in a single feed. So that obviously makes that bait a surplus baiting, a multi-feed and surplus bait. And then we have similar values, not as high, but similar for bromadiolone, difenicum, diphenhydramine. So none of those, a lethal dose could be ingested in a single feed. So they're all surplus baiting. And then we get down to brodifacoum. The lethal is 4.2. Storm, flocoumafen 3.8. And Storm Ultra 7.6. So we can see that brodifacoum and flocoumafen baits, they can all be pulse baited because this lethal dose, these 2 times LD50s, can be eaten in what we think is our typical meal size, which is 6 to 8 grams of food by our 250 gram brown rat. Now we look in more detail at pulse baiting. This is a graphical representation of how Storm controls an infestation, working through the different hierarchical levels within this infestation. So if you look at the triangle on the left, this represents the different levels in an infestation. So we have the dominants, the bosses. Then under that we have the subdominants, the kind of lieutenants. And then below that, the non-dominants. Now the non-dominants there could be 2 or 3 other hierarchical levels here, but for simplicity, we've just used the 3 levels: dominants, subdominants, and non-dominants. If we now look at the graph on the right, this is how this then transposes into how we control the infestation. So on day 1, we have our first pulse of storm. The dominants will then eat this bait. They'll claim this bait. And remember, because it's single feed, they'll eat a lethal amount of bait within the first day, within the first feed. 4 to 5 days later, they'll start to feel the effects of this, go to their burrows until they, in their minds, recover, but we know they'll go to their burrows or nests, and that's where they'll die. Now we're ready for the second pulse. So the second pulse, whether it be day 4 or 7, that's then placed. And now this second pulse will then control the next hierarchical level. They'll eat the bait, ingest enough in a single feed, a lethal amount in a single feed, and then 4 to 5 days later, they'll go to their burrows, harborages, nests to recover, but will actually die there. And then 7 days later, we do the same again. So every 7 days, we have a pulse, 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 and then this controls one of the hierarchical levels, and we move down through that. So after 14 to 21 days, we've controlled the whole infestation. And that is the principle behind the practicalities of pulse baiting. Here we have a graphical representation of a typical trial with Storm Ultra. The principles that I go through now apply to both Storm and Storm Ultra. But if we look at this particular graph now, we can see that on the vertical axis we have bait per bait point in grams, and this is 50 grams. So each Storm Ultra block is Storm Ultra Secure is 25 grams. So we have 2 Storm Ultra Secure blocks per bait point. On the horizontal axis, we have days of baiting from 1 to 21. We have then on day 1, we have our first pulse of baiting. So each bait point has 50 grams of bait placed. And then on day 2, because the rats have eaten the bait, we now have only 25 grams of bait at each bait point. And then on day 3, we can see actually there is no bait. And remember before we've discussed that that's okay if there are periods throughout this bait treatment where there is actually no bait available to the infestation. Then we have the second pulse on day 4, and that takes us back up to our 50 grams per bait point. And then a similar thing. So this is now the second wave of the infestation we're controlling with our second pulse, our next level of hierarchy. After we've pulsed on day 4, day 5, we can see again that the bait per bait point has gone down to 25 grams. And then on days 5 and 6, again, there is no bait in place. We have our third pulse on day 7. And again, day 8, 25 grams remaining. Day 9, maybe 10 grams. And then from day 9 to 14 grams, we can see that there's no bait available. We then have our fourth pulse on day 14. So now the bait that's been taken, the rate at which it's been eaten is slowing down as we've controlled 3 waves of the hierarchy with our first, second and third pulse. So on our 14-day pulse, so our fourth pulse, we replenish the eaten bait again back up to the 50 grams per bait point. And then the amount of bait at the bait point, it becomes more each day as less and less is eaten. And then we can see that by the time we get to day 19, 20, 21, the amount of bait at each bait point is leveling off. This means that there's no more storm being eaten and we have control. And this is a typical representation of a storm field trial with pulse baiting. Now we have a graphical representation of if we take that pulse baiting from the last slide and overlay it with surplus baiting. So the pulse baiting with the Storm Secure is in Storm Ultra Secure, is in the blue as on the previous slide, and the orange represents surplus baiting, a multi-feed. So if we start on the day one, for the orange, for the surplus baiting, we can see we have the 200 grams per bait point. So the axes are the same as the previous slide. Bait per bait point on the vertical and days of baiting on the horizontal. So day one, we have surplus baiting 200 grams per bait point. By the second day, that's reduced to 100 grams as some of the bait's been eaten. The third day, 50 grams remains at the bait point. And now the problem is, because it needs to be surplus baited, now we need to replenish to replace the eaten bait. So on day 4, we replenish back up to 200 grams per bait point. And then we have the same pattern down to 100 on day 5, 50 on day 6, and then we have to replenish again, because all the time, remember, we must make sure that there's surplus of bait available. So day 7, we replenish again at each bait point back up to 200, and then this pattern continues. And after we get to, say, day 14, we can see that again that the bait consumption starts to slow down a little bit as some of the rodents are controlled. And then eventually, when we get to day 24 and we replenish, then we can see that for the last 4 days for the surplus baiting, the amount per bait point is stable at 100 grams per bait point. So there we've controlled the infestation. And we can see from this the massive difference, a significant difference between 50 grams per bait point and 200, and between the number of replenishments back up to the maximum bait. And this shows a good representation of surplus and pulse baiting and how they differ in a typical treatment. Next, I want to show you the results of a Storm Ultra field trial demonstrating how all this theory comes together in actual practice. This slide now then shows the results of how we controlled a brown rat infestation with Storm Ultra Secure and pulse baiting. The infestation was at a bar/restaurant in an urban area, and if we look at the photograph on the right hand side, we can see that at the side of the building there was the rubbish bins, and also we can see where harbourage was, so waste on the floor. So the husbandry for this particular establishment wasn't at the best, the hygiene. And if we now look at the graph that shows the actual results. So when we do one of these infestation controls, how do we actually prove to the customers, to regulatory authorities, that the trial actually worked? Well, I'll go through how we prove that now. By looking at the graph, we can see on the left-hand side, the vertical column, we have amount of either census diet or bait, so Storm Ultra, eaten per day. And I'll come back to in a few moments what I mean by census diet. And on the horizontal axis, then we have days that this trial took place. And it's broken into really 5 parts. We have a pre-census, then a lag, then we treat with the Storm Ultra, then another lag, and the post-census. So I'll go through each of those phases. So like I say, how do we know that we've actually controlled the infestation, the rat infestation with Storm Ultra? Well, to begin with, we actually measure the infestation. So we offer the infestation every day for 4 consecutive days, a census diet. And in this case, it's just blank whole wheat, just plain whole wheat, no active, nothing. And we measure how much is eaten by the rats every day for 4 days. And we can see here that if we average those 4 days take, and this is our pre-census, the average was around 900 grams a day. And we say that for every 10 grams a day, that equals approximately 1 rat. And this method we use no matter what bait that we put up for a trial. So for this infestation, we have approximately 90 rats. So the next phase we go to is the lag. So we have this just before we bait with the Storm Ultra, we have a lag. And this is where we remove all the wheat and have 10 days with nothing on the site. And this is so that there is no accusation or no concern that we've actually encouraged the rodents to feed on that site by offering them wheat. So for 10 days, there is nothing. And then we go in with the Storm Ultra. And we can see the red arrows, they're what are actually when we pulse baited. So on day, we've pulse bait to begin with, and then where we can see the first day's take on day 1 was just over 800 grams. And then as expected, then we go to the second day, that was 400 grams. The third day, just under 200. And then on the fourth day, we pulse baited again. So the take goes back up now, because now we have more bait available to the infestation. So our first pulse has controlled our first wave of the hierarchy in our infestation, if you remember the triangle with the dominance at the top. And then, so we pulse on day 4, and then that controls the second wave. And then again, we pulse on day 7, but by this point, we've now entered 3 pulses of control. And then if we look at the take between day 5, 6 and 7, we can see that that's greatly reduced, because that's the average over all, that's the total, sorry, of all 3 days. But then on days 8, 9 and 10, we had no bait take. So for a normal end user, they wouldn't be going and measuring take every day. But we do this just so we can show to customers what is actually going on, what's actually happening with the bait take in an infestation. But for an end user, they just pulse on day 1, at the beginning on day 1, then day 4 on day 7. So here we can see we had no bait take on days 8, 9 and 10. So then following that, we removed all the bait from the infestation, so no bait was available. And then we had a post-treatment lag period. And this was to allow the rats that were the last to eat the bait to either die or recover. And remember, it takes 4 to 10 days for a rodent to die of anticoagulant poisoning. And then after the post-treatment lag, we then again go back in with the wheat. And just as before with the pre-census, the post-census is exactly the same. We offer the whole wheat every day for 4 consecutive days. And we can see from this graph that we had 0 take for those 4 consecutive days. So from this graph, we can conclude that we had 100% control of our 90 rats with 9 days of baiting and 3 pulses. Each pulse being, like I said, the red arrow. But what if the rats were still there, they just weren't feeding? So the next thing we do is we look at another method of actually recording the rat's activity apart from what they're eating. So this graph shows the second method of recording the rat activity. So this is exactly the same trial, the Storm Ultra pulse baited brown rats at our bar restaurant. And while we were doing the pre-census with the wheat, at the same time we were recording tracking activity. Now this tracking activity, we record it just simply by placing sand about the size of your foot, a patch about the size of your foot, and then the next day we go and look at the number of prints that are on that. What percentage of that patch is covered with rat prints? And we do this every day at the same time that we're recording either census take or bait take. So on this graph now, at the left, at the vertical column, we have the tracking score. So here there may be 20, 30 tracking patches, and every day we add up the total score from each of those. And then we have the census After the pre-census, we then have this lag. Again, this is all running at the same time as we're doing all that we've mentioned in the previous graph. And then we go in with the Storm Ultra, like we've said, and we have the matching pulses with the red arrows because it's the same trial, and we carry on recording tracking activity. And we can see that the tracking activity is dropping with each pulse quite dramatically. And again, now we look at days 9 and 10, and we have no activity. Then after we've finished recording the tracking activity, and when we've removed the bait, like we said, we have the lag period. And then when we go in with the post-treatment, the post-census wheat, we also go and look at post-census tracking activity. And again, we can see this is 0 for 4 consecutive days. So now we know that for post-treatment, with the two methods we've chosen, so that's how much wheat is eaten and the tracking activity, we can see by both methods we have 100% control with 9 days of baiting of the Storm Ultra, pulse baited, and 3 pulses. So we've mentioned all about pulse baiting and how you pulse bait, and we've shown you some results. So now let's look at the actual advantages of pulse baiting. So I've mentioned a couple of times throughout this PowerPoint how for surplus baiting that more bait is required per bait point. So I've actually looked at labels, and these I've named the active ingredient for the rodenticide bait rather than the competitor name, because there are many baits with the same active ingredient. So we have coumatetralyl, bromadiolone, difenacoum, and diphthiolone. And then obviously they're all surplus baiting, as we've mentioned, and then with pulse baiting, Storm Secure. So let's look at the bait point size that are actually on the labels. So for each of those that are surplus baiting, these are what they say. For rats, 200 for coumatetralyl, and then the next 3 are up to 200. For mice, coumatetralyl isn't toxic to mice, so mice are not on the label. But for bromadiolone, difenacoum, diphthiolone, either up to 40 or up to 50 grams per bait point. And then we look at Storm Secure. So for rats, it's 40 to 60 grams, and for mice, 20 grams. So what we can see here is that there's less bait placed in the environment. So we're placing 40 to 60 grams as opposed to up to 200. And that means there's actually less bait waste. And then if there's less bait placed and less bait wasted, then obviously as an end user, there's actually less bait required to be purchased in the first place. So that's less bait per bait point. That's advantage 1. So the second advantage now of pulse baiting with Storm is there are fewer visits required to replenish, to top up the bait. And this is really important in heavy infestations where you could have many bait points, 50, 100. That's okay because we have fewer visits required. And again, as I've mentioned a few times, there will be times when there's no bait available for the rodents, but that's okay because that's factored in. So there's no need for the end users to be worrying, do I have to go back just in case there's no bait available? Like they have to worry if there is a multi-feed and the surplus baiting method. So what I have is fewer bait replenishments with the pulse baiting. That saves on time, obviously, because you have fewer visits. And again, like we said, it saves on the worry of and the concern, is there sufficient bait there at each bait point? So above and beyond what it states on the labels, the end user doesn't have to try and incorporate any more visits to replenish. And the third advantage of pulse baiting is the quicker control. Because the active substances that are contained in the baits, like Storm, that are allowed to have this pulse baiting technique, are those that are the more potent to the target species, the rats and mice, then we get quicker control. So if the rat or mouse only has to eat a single feed, so on the first day that they approach the bait, and the amount they have to eat is significantly smaller than with the multi-feeds, then the sooner they eat the bait, the sooner that they'll feel the effects, go to their burrows and die. And we can get through these hierarchical segments quickly, rather than having to wait 2-3 days for each rodent to eat a lethal dose. And this is particularly important for rats. So there are 3 advantages. In this final slide, I would like to summarise the benefits of baiting with storm. So I'm going to look at pulse baiting versus surplus baiting. And I looked at all the brown rat data we have on field trials that were undertaken by BASF. So we have, first of all, so on the orange we have the surplus baiting, and that was with difenacoum. Difenacoum is the surplus baiting active that BASF have. And pulse baiting then obviously with storm. And then we look at the benefits of one versus the other. So I looked at how much bait we place, how much we replenish, how often we replenish, to come up with the data behind this. So if we start the first row, the initial amount of bait used. So for 50 bait points, with a surplus baiting, remember it's 200 grams per bait point, we would have placed 10 kilos. With storm, with our pulse baiting, for these 50 bait points, at 3 blocks, so 60 grams per bait point, is 3 kilos. So already we've placed 7 kilos less, or 70% less than with the traditional surplus baiting. And then bait replenishment is the next thing. So I looked at the data we have. How much bait do we on average replenish for our surplus baiting field trials and our pulse baiting field trials? So for these 50 bait points, it would be 8.19 grams of our multi-feed. And for the storm, it would be only 1.5 grams. So we can see here that the benefit is that it's 6.69 grams. So 6.7, nearly 7 grams less bait would be used in top-up, or 80%, 82% less bait than with the traditional surplus baiting. So if we add these two together and we get the total bait used, we can see that for the surplus baiting, we have over 18 kilos would be used for our 50 bait points, while with storm, only 4.5 kilos. So 70%, 75% less bait used than with the traditional surplus baiting. And then if we look at control, so for the surplus baiting, the average was 98% control, which is excellent. There's not an issue with these eventually do control in 25 days. For the storm, again, it was coincidentally 98% control was the average from the trials analysed, but in 21 days. So we had the same level of control, but quicker. And now if we look at the typical baiting visits, with the surplus baiting, as we say, it was to begin with, every 3 to 4 days. And then it was only towards the end, we went from day 14 to 21, so a week, and then back on day 25 for a clear up to remove all bait from the environment. And with storm, say 3, 0, 3, 7, 14, 21. So 2 less visits. So we had the same level of control, but quicker, with 2 less visits to replenish and 75% less bait. So this shows that on a practical level, why baiting with storm and using the pulse baiting technique, you can achieve control of the infestation save time on your time, on the operator costs by less frequent visits, and save cost on bait used. Okay. And that concludes the PowerPoint presentation on pulse baiting with Storm and Storm Ultra baits. So now I think we have time for some questions and answers. So thank you for listening.